Mixed conditions, frustrated drivers, and some silly season news. This week we're chatting all about the Canadian Grand Prix, so get ready because you've been summoned to the Steward's office. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Steward's office. I'm Saira and this week we are chatting all about the Canadian Grand Prix as F1 headed out to the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. I cannot believe that we are 9 races into this F1 season. We are nearly at the halfway mark. It feels like it's gone really quickly and also really slowly at the same time. And this F1 season has not panned out the way I thought it was going to, especially after testing and the first 2 to 3 races of the season. We have had a couple of different winners, a couple of different pole sitters. The championships are not looking the way that I thought they were going to, both in the constructors and in the drivers. So there has been a lot going on. And Canada added to all of that interest and intrigue in this season as well and had some unexpected things happen. And those things were happening on and off the track, outside the F1 paddock. So let's start off by diving into the latest news. Last week we had the news that Esteban Ocon would not be driving with Alpine in the 2025 F1 season. This was not off the back of what happened in Monaco, or at least it wasn't the whole reason. When Esteban Ocon caused a collision with Pierre Gasly, Esteban had to retire from the race, and had that collision been any worse, Pierre would have probably also had to have retired. So as far as we know, that was not the sole reason. It might have played into it, but that's not what triggered it. But Esteban Ocon, like the majority of the drivers on the F1 grid, was running out of a contract at the end of this year, and it just turns out that Alpine and Esteban agreed that they no longer wanted to continue their relationship. Now, I don't know who got the ball rolling on that conversation. I don't know whether Esteban decided that he didn't want to carry on driving with Alpine, or whether it was Alpine who said that they wanted a different driver in that seat. But someone definitely kicked off that conversation, and Esteban will not be driving with Alpine. Now, I have thought for a while now that Esteban would not be driving with Alpine in 2025. It was a gut feeling. I didn't really have any rhyme or reason to it when I first made that prediction, just a gut feeling. Of course, that does leave the question, where does he go? What does Alpine do? And with Esteban Ocon, look, I still think he's going to end up on the F1 grid next year. I don't think it's that he's going to be out of an F1 seat. I genuinely think he will find another seat in F1. Toto Wolff is part of his management team as well, so you've got that sort of helping him out. And I think there are 3 possibilities for him here. Williams, Sauber and Haas are the 3 teams that I think could end up taking Esteban Ocon. Now, if you'd asked me before this race weekend, when we'd first heard the news, I would think that Williams was the number 1 team that were going to take him. And that is partly because Toto is part of Esteban's management team. However, we've had a lot of talk this weekend in the media and from James Vowles about wanting Carlos Sainz in the Williams seat. James seems really, really eager to get Carlos paired up with Alex Albon for next year. Obviously, that does depend on whether Carlos also wants to drive with Williams, but that's made me kind of wonder whether or not Esteban will get that seat. With Haas and with Sauber, I still think there's a possibility that Esteban could end up in either of those seats. There have been even more rumours about Ollie Behrman driving in Haas next year. We thought we were going to get an announcement during this race weekend out in Canada. That didn't happen, but it feels like they've all but signed a contract at this point, and I don't know whether Haas are going to be waiting for Silverstone before they announce that, because it would be Ollie's home race and he'll be there with F2 as well. So if they do sign Ollie, he's technically taking Nico Hülkenberg's seat. Kevin Magnussen is out of a contract at the end of this year, and it's a toss-up as to whether Haas want to keep him or not. And then with Sauber, like I said, Nico Hülkenberg is leaving Haas, moving to Sauber/Audi in 2025, and both of Sauber's current drivers are without contract. They finish at the end of 2024, and I do wonder whether Sauber and then Audi want just an entirely fresh driver lineup or whether they want some continuity. So there are possibilities there for them. So there are some possibilities and some seats available for Esteban Ocon. Looking at Alpine though, I think there's one really strong contender and there's one that's more left of field for me. Both of them come from within the Alpine family, and the guy that I think is most likely going to be taking that seat in Alpine is Jack Doohan. He's been a part of their development program for a number of years. He turns up to the races now after he finished F2. He's been on the sidelines helping Alpine with their development and their sim racing, and is their reserve driver. Now, I really like Jack Doohan. I loved watching him race in F2. I think he's got a great amount of talent, and I would absolutely love to see more rookies on the grid. So I think he's like their number one contender right now because he's been doing a lot of runs for them. He did FP1 out in Canada, which didn't last very long because of the rain, but I do think he is their number one choice. The more left of field option, I think, for Alpine would be Mick Schumacher. He is currently racing in the World Endurance Championship for Alpine, and from the sounds of it, Alpine are really happy with what he's doing in endurance at the moment, so there is an option there as well. But I do think Alpine are going to be picking from within their own family. I saw a post the other day that said something along the lines of they do think it'll be Jack Doohan because Alpine want to show that their development and their junior program is working. And I do think that's going to be something in the back of Alpine's mind after everything that went on with Oscar Piastri. So yes, I do really think, and I'm leaning more towards that Jack Doohan will be in that car next year. Either way, I wouldn't be upset about it. I think at this point I would prefer Jack Doohan just because I want to see more rookie drivers, and he spent a year out of racing at the moment, waiting for an F1 seat, looking around, talking to people. So I think it would be great to see him in Formula One. We also had two pieces of news about drivers that are definitely going to be sticking around in Formula One. Now, the first piece comes from Red Bull, and they have opted to re-sign Sergio Perez until the end of 2026. By the sounds of it, he is on a 2-year contract with the team. I can't lie to you guys, I am slightly surprised that they have done this so early on in the season. We're not even halfway in, but they've really locked in Sergio Perez for the long haul. They think it's the best thing for their team to have that continuity with Max and with Checo. So that is a decision that they've made. Part of me did think that they were going to be signing Checo Perez again. It's not that I thought he was completely out of the running. However, I did think it was going to be a 1-year contract or a 1+1 year contract. I didn't know whether or not they would want to definitely take him into this next era of engine regulations in 2026, but apparently that is the case. So they are keeping Sergio Perez around. And then over the actual Canadian Grand Prix weekend, and I'm talking just moments before qualifying was going to happen, Visa Cash App RB announced that Yuki Tsunoda was going to be staying with the team. This is probably one of the best pieces of silly season news that I've personally seen because I absolutely love Yuki Tsunoda. I think he's been a very underrated driver. He's flown under the radar. However, when you look at his performances since 2023, when you look at his consistency and how hard he's worked and his racecraft, you can see how far it's come since he first started Formula One. You can see the development that he's had. You can see the growth that he's had as a driver and the way he's helping out the team now. I absolutely think he deserves a seat on the grid in 2025. I didn't know whether VCARB were going to opt to sign him. I didn't know whether Yuki Tsunoda was going to opt to stay with VCARB, but it sounds like they're both really happy. I think for Yuki, what he's seen is that VCARB has made a very big jump this season. They've made a lot of progress. It's been a big step forward for them. And he's also able to reap the benefits of that and reap the rewards of that by qualifying quite well, by getting into the points, and VCARB can see that side of it. So it is a relationship that works really well and both driver and team are benefiting from it. So it does make sense that they've re-signed him. However, Yuki is on a 1-year contract. They haven't given him any longer. As far as we know, it's not even a 1+1 year. It is just a flat out 1-year contract. That does leave both his and VCARB's options open for 2026. So we'll see what happens there. From what the rumours were saying though, there were a lot of midfield teams in particular that were eyeing up Yuki Tsunoda and were interested in potentially signing him to their team, which makes a lot of sense because, like I said, he's been very consistent. He's honed in his racecraft and he's doing so well over the season and since 2023. So those were the silly season news, but we also had what I would probably say is an even bigger piece of news drop this week, or this past week, right? But basically what we had was the FIA publishing the new 2026 F1 regulations. Looking at 2026, when we've heard chat about the regulations for that year, it's been a lot about the engine. That's a lot of what we've heard about. It's a lot of what the teams are focusing on. It's the power unit and making sure that everything is ready for that new era of engine regulations. However, the FIA have opted to make some changes to the chassis of the car to try and improve racing. So what is actually going on with all these regulations? I did do a quick rundown over on my TikTok at stewards_office, so make sure you go follow me over there as well if you aren't already. But here is what the regulations are saying if you didn't catch that video. The whole point in these regulations, both the engine and the chassis, the aerodynamics and everything that they're bringing in, it's to encourage more overtaking, better racing, sustainability and safety. That is really what the FIA are trying to improve. All of those areas, okay? They want to have a lighter and more nimble car for better raceability. So what we are looking at is the cars being 30 kilograms lighter. It should, in theory, be easier for the drivers to handle. It shouldn't look as sluggish when it goes around corners because it is a lighter car. F1 are also moving into an era of active aerodynamics. It'll be a moving front wing and a moving rear wing. There are basically two modes that the drivers can swap between. That'll help them achieve top speed. We are saying goodbye to DRS. That is one thing I don't necessarily think anyone was really expecting from these regulations, but DRS is leaving and in its place becomes manual overtaking mode. And essentially what MOM, manual overtaking mode, is going to give us is a little bit of extra electrical energy to a driver that's following within 1 second of the driver ahead. So it's kind of the same in terms of DRS. The drivers still have to be within 1 second of the car they are following, but instead of opening the rear wing up, they're now going to get an extra boost of electrical energy for a short amount of time. The FIA are really hoping that this will help with the overtakes. I'm curious how much the energy boost is going to be and also how long it will last. Downforce and drag on the F1 cars is going to be reduced, and what this should help with is the teams not having to set up the cars to be as low down or as stiff. Looking at the actual engine though and what this era of regulations is all about, we're looking at a more efficient power unit that's also more sustainable. They will be using 100% sustainable fuels in 2026, every single F1 car, and that is really a step towards the FIA and F1 wanting to reach their sustainability goals of being net zero by 2030. So this will be a massive help in that aim and that project. We're also looking at around 300% more battery power, and there'll be an equal split between electric power and the internal combustion. On the outside, looking in at all of these regulations, it sounds great. In theory, all of this sounds brilliant. However, the teams already have some concerns. There have been mutterings and mumblings about whether the active aero and the movable front and rear wing will actually not be great in this era of the cost cap, because if those get damaged, it's going to take a lot of money to repair them. We've had some people say that they think these cars are going to be slower, some people saying that they're only going to be a couple of seconds off the F2 cars, and the last thing that F1, the drivers, the teams and the fans want are slower cars. The thing is, though, that all of these regulations are not yet set in stone. They have to go to the World Motorsport Council, and by the end of the month, they should be approved. Now, the FIA said they're still going to go through refinements with the teams. Changes will be made, and they'll listen and take on board what the teams are saying. So there might be a couple of small things that will change along the way, but by and large, from what it sounds like at the moment, the teams aren't overly happy about the 2026 regulations. And I don't think it's so much to do with the engine. I think it's all the parts they're changing with the chassis and the aerodynamics that the teams don't seem 100% sold on. But those were some of the biggest pieces of news we've had come out around F1 this past week. Let's get into the actual race weekend though, and what happened when the cars hit the track at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve. Well, it was damp, it was wet, there were mixed conditions, and for the practice sessions especially, it was just hard to get a read on what was going on with the cars. Before FP1 happened, there was just torrential downpours going on around the circuit. It was hailing, it was awful. F1 had to evacuate the circuit with all the fans before eventually letting them back into the circuit when free practice started. So we had some wet running, we had some dry running, but it was just hard to get a read on all of the teams, if I'm honest with you. Quali had so much going on. It was a really, really good quali session out at the Canadian Grand Prix, and it all kicked off in Q1. Sergio Perez did not make it through into Q2. This now makes it back-to-back Q1 knockouts for the Red Bull driver, and that is not a welcome start for both him and the team to have. On the other side of things though, Logan Sargent had a really good Q1 session, got out of Q1 into Q2 and finished Q1 in P9, and that meant that both Williams drivers were going into Q2, and at the end of Q1 Yuki Tsunoda also finished in P2. So there was a lot going on and a lot of people to be excited for, but extremely gutting for Sergio Perez in Q1. Q2, however, was a very, 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 very sad story for Ferrari, where both of their drivers got knocked out. Now, we have to look back to Belgium 2021, when we saw two Ferrari drivers not being able to get out of Q2 and into Q3. Ferrari had not been showing great pace throughout the entire weekend. They weren't as quick as they were out in Monaco, and the car looked just sluggish and hard to handle at times. Bearing in mind all of that though, right, I thought at least one of them would make it into Q3, and if you had that information that the car wasn't that quick, I'm not entirely sure why they then decided to send out both of their drivers on used tyres for their last flying laps when everyone else was going to be on new tyres. You're putting them at a disadvantage straight away, but I think that is mainly what caused neither driver to get into Q3. However, even though both Ferraris can get into Q3, both V-Carbs managed it. Daniel and Yuki managed to get into Q3. And in Q3, we ended up seeing George Russell taking pole position. Now, that was something I really was not expecting. Mercedes had looked strong this weekend. It wasn't like it came out of absolutely nowhere. They were running really well. Both cars had the new front wing this weekend as well. It wasn't just George's car. But I just wasn't expecting them to do that well, that George would manage to get pole position. Max Verstappen was right behind him. He got P2 and he had set the exact same time as George Russell. But because George had set the time first, it meant that he took pole position. But oh my gosh, like it wasn't even that long ago we were seeing Max Verstappen get pole position by half a second to his teammate, let alone the rest of the grid. And now we're seeing him set the exact same times as George Russell. That's insane to me, and I hope that's a sign in general in F1 of good development of all of the cars. Lando Norris then took P3 once again. The McLaren's looking really, really good throughout the weekend. Then it was race day, and this has to be one of my favourite races this season, even though 9 races in, I get it, but it was already placing itself in one of my favourite races of 2024. Now, part of me does know that that is because of the rain. We started off with a very wet circuit and then started to rain a little bit, stopped, track started to dry up, then it started to rain again, and then it started to dry up again, right? So I'm well aware that part of the reason it was so entertaining as a whole was because of the conditions of the track. Do I wish we'd have entertaining F1 races more frequently when there wasn't rain? Absolutely, of course. As much as I love wet races, I don't want them to be the only reason that an F1 race is enjoyable. That's really not what I want, and I don't think it's what a lot of people want, to be fair. You want there to be good racing, competitive, interesting racing, regardless of the weather forecast. However, I will take it for now. It was an entertaining race and I really, really enjoyed it because there was just so much going on. And when it rains, the strategists are really having to rack their brains and think about what is the best move to make. We had both Haas cars starting off on full wet tyres when everyone else was on intermediates. We had people wondering when the crossover was going to happen. Was it worth changing for a set of slicks when there's been more rain coming in? What would be the best time for the slick tyres? We had safety cars coming in that kind of changed up. Do we pit for new inters? Do we pit for slick tyres? Who's going to get that advantage of either the intermediate tyres or the slick tyres, depending on when and how we pit? So there was just a lot going on. There was a lot of on-track action as well. We had overtakes. We had a couple of spins and collisions, which not as great, but we had them following Fernando and Lewis for ages. Lewis was behind Fernando's car, and the TV director absolutely loved us seeing that battle, even though I'm pretty sure Lewis ended up pitting, and that's how he overtook Fernando Alonso anyway. But on the topic of TV direction, was it just me, or did it feel like TV direction was a little bit off this race? We had so many notifications popping up on screen about the FIA noting an incident between two cars, or giving someone a penalty, or investigating an incident, or we'd see something flash up saying, you know, yellow flag sector 2. We would have no clue what was going on because we weren't seeing any of this happen. We weren't seeing any of the incidents, any of the collisions, any of the contacts, the spinning, nothing like that. And it was taking a little bit for us to even get to those bits as well. It wasn't like, okay, you know what? We didn't realise someone was going to spin. Fair enough. But it was taking a little bit for them to actually show us the replay or show us a car reversing out of a wall or something. That felt a little bit off to me because it felt like a game of guess who. You know, we'd see a yellow flag, wonder what happened. We would hear about potential investigations between drivers, not have a clue why that was going on. So that's the one thing I would say about the Canadian Grand Prix, is that I sometimes felt a little bit out of the loop in what was actually going on with the rest of the track. But with what was going on in general during the Canadian Grand Prix, I guess you can't keep a track of absolutely everything, and you don't know when something is going to cause a safety car or a red flag or whatever it is, whether it's a VSC or a yellow flag, whatever. But yeah, it's hard to actually keep track of it all when there is more action happening on track now. We ended up getting 2 safety cars during that Grand Prix though. One of them was for Logan Sargent, so they could grab that car. The second one was for Alex Albon's car. So Williams technically causing both yellow flags, even though Alex Albon's wasn't necessarily his fault. We'll get into that later. The top 5 of the Grand Prix, right? Now, Max Verstappen did end up winning. Then it was Lando Norris. Then we had George Russell, Lewis Hamilton, and rounding out the top 5 was Oscar Piastri. But even though Max won this race, this was a Grand Prix in general where I wouldn't have completely been assured that Max was going to win it. And that's not just because he didn't start on pole position, but it could have been between him, George, and Lando for quite a bit of the race, to be fair. So it wasn't that super predictable, oh, Max won. It was Max won, but it could have been any of them. So yeah, overall, I did enjoy this Grand Prix. Let's have a dive into all of the F1 teams and how I think they did this weekend, though. And we are going to be starting off with the team who are leading the Constructors' Championship, and that is Red Bull. We need to talk about Sergio Perez, I think, because he had an awful weekend. It was an absolute stinker of a weekend for Sergio Perez. From re-signing his contract to then getting knocked out in Q1 to then DNFing and not scoring any points. 2 weekends in a row that he hasn't scored points, and I think Crofty was saying the stat was something like he has scored 4 points in the past 3 races. That's just not great. That's really, really not great. That's not a stat. Those 2 stats are not things that any driver in a top flight team, in a team like Red Bull, are gonna want, right? The thing is that yes, Red Bull have re-signed him and that is great. However, he is going to need to find his form again. And I feel like this is something that we talk a lot about with Sergio Perez, where he does fall off for a couple of races, whether that's him or his luck or the people around him, wherever it is. And it takes him a couple of races and then he does okay again. And it's peaks and troughs for Sergio, I find. And I think that was, okay, it wasn't okay, but I think it was less of a concern for Red Bull when there was a very big margin to the rest of the teams in Formula One. What's happening at the moment, though, is that a lot of the teams are catching up with Red Bull. Red Bull aren't having the easiest of weekends, which allow teams like McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes at the moment to bag big points. And that is going to cause them an issue if Sergio Perez is not regularly scoring big points, not getting into Q3. He did get let off a little bit easy in terms of him DNFing did not cause as much of an issue for Red Bull as it could have. And that's simply because both Ferrari drivers DNF'd. And even if they hadn't DNF'd, Ferrari weren't doing well in the race. They were either just in the points, I'm talking P9, P10, or they were just out of the points completely, right? So he was saved a little bit there. Red Bull was saved a little bit there. But I don't think that's always going to be the case with Ferrari. I think this was a bad weekend for them, but I don't think that's going to be something consistent we see from this team. And even if it is, right, okay, that's fine. So you took Ferrari out of the equation. McLaren are insanely strong at the moment. So yeah, I think Red Bull are going to be looking at Sergio and his performance and asking him to up it and to make sure he's getting into Q3 and he's bringing home big points. And we're talking Red Bull 1-2s, Red Bull 1-3s. You guys need to be on the podium at least, taking points for fastest laps, because the rate of development that other teams are showing at the moment is going to mean that, yeah, Red Bull might be in trouble if both of their drivers can't fight at the front. Because it was just a tough weekend for Red Bull. It wasn't, like I mentioned, an easy win for Max Verstappen. He didn't take pole position. He didn't get the fastest lap of the race. He had issues in practice. He wasn't necessarily happy during the race. We heard that he wasn't exactly comfortable once again riding the curbs. So not a straightforward weekend, but he did get the win. He did manage to bring that car over the line first, and he should be absolutely chuffed with that because it wasn't an easy race. Obviously, you're trying to overtake and you're trying to win, but there is that added jeopardy of a wet track. So he did a brilliant job to bring home that win. Moving on to Ferrari, and it was a nightmare weekend for them. No Q3, no points to take home, both drivers DNFing. Charles ended up DNFing because of a power unit issue, and with Carlos Sainz, I mean, he ended up spinning. I think his wheel just caught a wet part of the track, and yeah, managed to drive back to the pits but couldn't carry on. Charles really was not a happy bunny after qualifying. In particular, he was just not impressed. I don't think he was happy about the fact that Ferrari had opted to use used tyres, and then yeah, during the race as well, it was just a mess. He had issues with his power unit that were reported from lap 4 of the race. He was losing half a second down the straight, so they had pitted him for slick tyres, which seemed too early, pitted him again for intermediates, sent him back out, and then a couple of laps after that, he ended up retiring. But yeah, Quali especially just was not a happy bunny, went into the media pen and was just like, you know what, I'm going to say what I want. And yeah, I think there was a lot of frustration, in particular from Charles Leclerc this weekend, especially coming off of the high of Monaco. McLaren were one of the teams that had a really good time of it out in Canada. They looked really strong once again. They had a podium, Oscar Piastri finishing in P5. It was a really good haul of points. And because Ferrari didn't take any points home, it meant that McLaren could close the gap with them in the Constructors' Championship. Mercedes also had a really positive weekend. This was by far their best weekend of the F1 season so far. Yes, it has only taken them 9 races to have what I would say is a good weekend. But pole position for George Russell, they finished in P3 and P4, so a really strong set of results. Lewis Hamilton took home the point for fastest lap. So overall, yes, a strong weekend. George did make a couple of mistakes on track and was not happy with that. Lewis Hamilton was also really hard on himself in the media pen, and they said that he just wasn't happy with his performance. He really wasn't pleased with it, but this was his best finish of the season. Yeah, P4 has been his best finish of the season so far, but he was not happy. I don't think George was overly happy not being able to convert the pole into a win. So yes, overall positive, but I think their drivers and the team itself are looking forward to more. Like I mentioned, yes, both drivers did have the new front wing and it was a strong weekend for them. However, do I think this is a form that will carry on? Can't say I believe that it's going to, just because history has shown us with Mercedes that consistency with their car is not something that they've managed to really lock down. The next circuit is Spain. It's circuit to Barcelona, Catalonia, and I don't know how this one is going to go for them. They do have packages that are coming in terms of upgrades and everything, but yeah, I don't know with Mercedes whether this is going to be form that carries on. Aston Martin, right, they actually had a decent weekend for them, especially compared to their recent form, right? Both drivers into Q3, both drivers scoring points. Lance Stroll got points in his home race. Overall, I think this is a solid weekend for them. Was fairly quiet, but probably what they wanted, just a quiet race where they got the job done. VCarb had a really strong qualifying, like I said, both cars into Q3. During the race, it wasn't awful, but quite a race for them. I don't think they could make massive inroads. The pace wasn't there for that. Daniel Ricciardo did finish in the points, which was wonderful. However, Yuki Tsunoda had a spin in the closing stages of the race and immediately just tumbled out of the points, which was gutting. But you know what? By and large, not a bad race for VCarb. Haas, right, okay, so they had a strategy at the beginning of the race that looked like it was going to work. I was one of those people that wondered what the hell they were doing when they put on the full wet tyres when everyone else was on intermediates, but they got them to work. It was the right call for the first couple of laps of the race. Kevin Magnussen was in P5 or P4 at one point. Looked like he was going to be able to chase down the top three, and then the track started drying up. So yeah, after that first stint on the wet tyres, it kind of just fell apart for them, and they've come home with no points. They were in P11 and P12, so just outside of the points. Would have been great after, you know, that interesting strategy of going on to the wets that did work out for them. Would have been wonderful to see them in the points, but was not meant to be. Williams, it was a nightmare like Ferrari. To have a double DNF is absolutely gutting. Logan, yes, driver error and he was at fault for his own DNF, but with Alex Albon, I am absolutely gutted. Carlos Sainz spun and he couldn't control the car, obviously, whether he was spinning. And Alex was just at the wrong part of the track at the wrong time and got caught out. And yeah, DNF'd, went into one of the walls and retired from the race. Really not his fault. And he was having such a good race up until that point. You know, there were some lovely overtakes. He was getting into some great battles. Logan, yeah, like I mentioned, driver error, had spun beforehand anyway, so this track was just not doing him any favours at all. And finally, we have Sauber, and you know what? Considering we had 5 DNFs, guys, yeah, 5 of them. And I said before, with Sauber, I think they need something like a weekend where we have mixed conditions, front runners like Sergio and Leclerc and Sainz are out of the race, and you know, five drivers out of the race means that you have more of an opportunity to get into the points, and they couldn't maximise on it. They did have a pit lane start, and you know, they was going to start in P17 and P20 anyway. They opted for a pit lane start because they wanted to change the rear wing assembly and put a few new parts onto Bottas's car, which is fair enough. But they just couldn't recover. They couldn't get into the points. But that just about summarises the Canadian Grand Prix. There was so much going on. Like I said, yeah, it was my favourite race of the season so far. There was so much going on, and it wasn't a race where I was dipping in and out of interest. There was so much going on when I was looking at the sort of timing screens, when I was looking up at the TV to actually watch the race. It kept me entertained, right? And I'm going to keep the hope that this will carry on. Maybe not the rain, right? But interesting racing will carry on for the rest of the season. That's what we want. It's what makes me happy. Qualifying had me on the edge of my seat as well. This was one of those things where all weekend long, it was just a really enjoyable F1 weekend. F1 do have a break now for the next week. There's no racing, and then we head out to the Circuit de Barcelona, Catalunya, and that kicks off a triple header as well, which is going to be pretty interesting, and I am fully expecting teams to bring more upgrades over that triple header now. But thank you guys so much for listening, and diolch yn fawr. Make sure you follow me on TikTok and Instagram at stewards_office, and I will see you guys next time you're summoned to the Stewards office.